most of the time the traffic control on the courses was really good. And the way they would set it up is you'd have a race envelope. So you'd have motos ahead of you and then the caravan behind you. So like they're kind of moving along, and as the lead motos and cars are coming through, they're pulling traffic off to the side. So generally speaking, it's mostly safe. But I mean, I've been in races where you're bombing down a descent and there's a tour bus coming up.
Right. That's so gnarly.
And that's where you just, to your point, like you're looking really far ahead and you're just anticipating, and you're anticipating in a relaxed and supple manner. So if something happens, you can respond rather than react. And that kind of goes back to like that little buffer zone where it's like knowing how to save it.
Right. Yeah. I feel like, I forgot to mention that, but that like being able to save it and being able to crash is so important. Like, I think that it's, when you look at like a beginner rider and even some more intermediate riders, especially on the mountain bike, there would be a situation where like an advanced rider would crash or like fall over, but it wouldn't even be a thing, right? Like you would just step off the bike, or like maybe it would just be a little bit wild and you would save it. Whereas like the intermediate rider would maybe fall and the beginner rider would maybe like actually get hurt. So, but yeah, that reminds me of like, you talking about coming up in the tour bus reminds me of like doing those urban races. Like,
oh god, that's so scary.
I'm so glad that those like are not really a thing anymore. Like there was like a couple of years where it was like they were like super important and you had to like actually go there. And I remember doing this one in Chile and coming down and there's like dogs running across the street, like right in the thing. You're like hopping a stair set and there's like a dog there and you're like, okay.
So sketchy. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine that. It's funny. So I served a church mission in Chile for 2 years, and I was in Valparaiso, and then like later on, when I came back and got into mountain biking, I was like, they race down those roads? Like, you're joking me. And the main reason, like, yeah, they were steep and gnarly, but the main reason I'm like, people just don't understand how many stray dogs there are in that country.
Totally,
like, it's like,
yeah, that's true so funny.
So and this is actually a really good dovetail to kind of the last topic I want to cover on technical riding and everything else before we get into talking about grow. So, okay. So there's the other side of things where, so a lot of people just assume that the top DH racers always have perfect runs. Like when Aaron Gwin wins, it's because he had a perfect run. And then the reason that somebody else didn't win is because they have a mistake. And perhaps that's true in some cases. But my assumption is actually that there's probably a whole different relationship with mistake management when you're going down like a downhill race. Like mistakes are made, and it's like how you kind of recover from those. So less than like technically speaking about how to recover from a mistake, because that's so like variable, right? That totally depends on the scenario there. I want to talk about like upstairs, what happens, because it's really easy. And, I've never done a DH race. I've only done some enduro races. That's the closest I get to that, but I usually do XC, or crit racing or anything else. But when I make a mistake, there's a temptation, and I bet it's this way for all of us, to be like, well, a mistake's been made. Like it's done, it's over, right?
Yeah.
And we lose focus. How do you make a mistake and then mentally recover mid-race, whether that's a crash or whether that's just missing a line?
Right. Yeah, that's such a great point. Yeah, that in downhill especially, like it's really rare to have a perfect run. Like those are the runs that you see that are just like those historic runs where you're like, man, they were on a different level. But yeah, I think so. The thing that I always did, I had to. A lot of people talk about like clearing their head and just like, blacking out and like being in the zone. But for me, it was the exact opposite. So like my best runs, I could like recite every single thing that I did and like how it felt, what I did, where I pedaled, like what I was thinking about. And so it was more about concentration. And when I would make a mistake, or when like some doubt would creep into my head, or when I would lose focus, I would always have a cue for myself where I could just like repeat this thing back. And for me, it was always like, there would be those times where like I would come through a section and I would hit it good. And like, I would be like, that was pretty good. And like, that was terrible that I would say that, because like, that means I've lost focus. And that means that I'm content. Because like, if I'm saying that's good enough, then like, I'm not going faster. So like, when I would do that, I would just say like, okay, go faster. Like get more, you know? And I would just say those things to myself to kind of bring myself back to reality. And I thought that that was like a good tool that I used, was just to have some sort of cue to keep myself on track. Because like you were saying, when you make a mistake, especially in like the shorter the event, the more harder it is mentally to come back from it, because you just lost time. It's impossible to like make up that time. Even if you had a perfect run, it would have been better if you didn't make the mistake. So I think it's about trying to somehow stay in the moment. And that's kind of different for everyone. But I always find that if I'm thinking about the past at all, if I thought, even if it's good, like whether it's that I hit a section good or I hit a section bad, or I wanted to hit something, or when you're about to come up on something and you're like, I'm offline. I think that's one of the other things that makes mountain bikers good, is that they are comfortable when things don't go right. And I think that's the same for all athletes, professional athletes, is that you have, right? Like I had planned out, you know, to the inch where I wanted to go, but when you're pushing, maybe I'm like 2 feet to the left of that line. And it's not about saying like, okay, the run's over now because I'm offline. It's just about saying like, okay, cool, here we go, and do this, and do this. Like, so I think like the point is, just trying to stay in the moment. Like, no matter, not thinking about the future, not thinking about the past, just saying like, here's what I'm going to do. Same with what Amber said about when you're there, it should come easy, even if it is like a blind race where like that preparation before lets you have that kind of confidence, where you're not having to make a ton of decisions.
Yeah, that I assume that this is kind of funny because we didn't anticipate this podcast being this like juxtaposition of road and off-road and how they're actually really similar, but this is fascinating to me. So I'm sure, Amber, you primarily rode in, so I mean, in a time trial it was just you, and I'm sure there were moments where you didn't, you know, the plan wasn't being executed as you had anticipated, but especially as a domestique, because that's what your role was in many cases. And because then, you know, there's so many things that have to go right in order to hit your plan how it needs to. And they're dependent upon so many other people, not just on your team, but all the other teams. Is it similar for you? Like, did you find to kind of keep the motivation and keep focus, even when things are going haywire, so to speak, in the middle of a race?
Oh yeah. I think there's a big difference here, which is, I'll quote my husband, David, who's a downhill ski racer. So he used to race slalom. So those races like yours, they're very, very short. In some cases, like with slalom, sometimes it's seconds long.
Totally.
So I would get nervous before a race and he would look at me like I was nuts and just be like, what are you worried about? You've got like 3 hours to figure this out. Like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
So, time-wise, there's a much bigger buffer to come back from mistakes as they happen. But I think that the underlying principles are exactly the same, which is stay present. You have to be present and meet the moment and meet what's happening in the moment. And getting too far ahead of yourself and trying to anticipate or worry about what might happen, it's irrelevant. You have to just handle what's happening right now. And sometimes that's the peloton's noodling along. So, okay, maybe it's a good time to eat. And then sometimes it's going berserk and you just have to go, even if you don't want to. I love your idea about using a cue. And I do a similar thing using a mantra, where if I find myself kind of getting out of my head, either because I'm really scared or I'm really nervous, having a mantra that just kind of brings me back to the present. It brings me back to like, what are the physical sensations right now? Or like one that I like to use is like chin up, eyes ahead. And it's just kind of like, okay, I'm checking back in with my body. Where am I looking right now? Where is my focus? What's happening ahead of me? And what do I need to do to meet this moment? And it's so hard to do because you can get totally caught up in something that happened 10K ago, but it doesn't matter. It's done. Like, you're now 10K ahead.
Totally. Yeah.
This is like a good lesson for all of us to even think about with our training. Like, you do an interval and it doesn't go as you planned. It's really tempting when we have any sign of bad news to kind of throw it away, but there's so much to be gained when we stick with it. And to give people some context too, like Amber, you mentioned, slalom skiing and downhill mountain biking is no different in terms of, it's not uncommon to have the top 10 of a downhill race to all be within 1 to 2 seconds. Like, think about that. Just like visualize a person coming across the finish line and another person 1 second behind that. And to think that 10 riders on totally separate runs, not riding with each other, all came down within that same second, it shows just like how close it is to like the absolute, peak performance level that you can achieve when that many athletes are that close. So it's like extra tempting in those situations just to be like, I made one imperfect step, so therefore throw the whole thing out. But that's not what it's about. And that's definitely not how you improve, right? You improve
Yeah.
by finding ways to adapt to that and then continuing thereafter,
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask you, there must have been races where like you won ugly. Like it wasn't pretty, but you won.
I remember like I had a couple, I did really well at a Crankworks race, got a podium there, and there was like in the middle of the track, there was like this 180 turn and my foot came off and I was kind of like riding 2-footed like through there, and I was like, okay, like all good, just get back going. And then at the very end, like I hit this bump and like nose freely down this big hill, like almost crashed. And then I was like, okay, I guess I'm still up. So like just keep and it was like kind of into the finish line. There's like this photo of me like almost going over the bars, and then yeah, like finishing second or third, I think it was. And
oh, my internet connection might be bad again.
oh,
we're back.
Okay. Yeah, my
just cut out right at the end. Right
okay.
when you were there was a picture of you going over the bars, almost going over the bars.
I just thought it was so funny, like that those, like you said, the ugly races could turn out to be good. And when you mention the closeness of the races, when you first start racing, I feel like there is that temptation to think about it only in a negative context. Like after you cross the line, that, oh my God, somebody beat me by like 0.01. And you kind of think back about, there was that half a pedal stroke that I missed, or like, 6 inches to the right here. But then I think there's kind of a mindset shift there to where it's like, it really makes you try to do your best, like during the run, because no matter what you do, you're probably gonna like either beat someone or get beaten by like 0.01. So like it's kind of all on you at that point, where it's like, okay, like as I'm in my run, I know that like this matters, like every single thing that I do matters, and that it has to be I'm going to try to do it perfect. And I think for me, it was kind of another motivator when I was doing my training. Like you talked about doing intervals. It was like, okay, how do I, like this one interval could actually make the difference between, 15th and a whatever. And I think that was kind of important for me to keep in mind. And the thing that's super frustrating about sport is that you can't make anything up. Like if you miss training or something, take a day off, it's not like you can train twice as hard the next day. Like it doesn't work like that. Like I did a 20-mile ride today, so I'm going to do a 40-mile ride like the next day. Or it's like, so it really, I think it was just like a good reminder where it's like, okay, like everything matters. And if I'm trying to do this, at a high level, like I need to make sure that I'm like putting, my best in at all points, like training and during the race.
And that connects back to what you were saying earlier about confidence. When you know that you've done all of your preparation, you've been consistent, with everything going into the actual race day, like that's the thing that's building your confidence going into competition.
Totally.